Yeah, you have a little special treat today because I decided to bring my dog with narcolepsy. His name is Watson, and I adopted him when he was 6 months. I had another dog with narcolepsy. He was a Schipperke called Bear, and he passed away. And almost at the same time, I received a phone call from Vermont, where they had a veterinarian told me that they had another dog with narcolepsy. Actually, his name was Possum. I changed his name into Watson, I'm sorry. Because I thought for DWN, dog with narcolepsy, I wanted to be politically correct. And it's Watson from Holmes and Watson. And he has narcolepsy, so I will show you how narcolepsy manifests in dogs. I mean, of course, you know, there are, because maybe some of you don't know, but we found the cause of narcolepsy and the link with orexin and hypocretin through the study of genetics of narcolepsy in dogs. So I'm kind of a canine specialist of narcolepsy as well, and I receive phone calls actually from veterinarians on how to treat narcolepsy in dogs regularly. And one day, the president of the animal medicine at Stanford called me and said, "You are practicing veterinary medicine without a license." Like if anyone else knew as much as I do about narcolepsy in dogs, you know. But that was quite interesting. But anyway, so I have a side practice if you have a dog with narcolepsy. And I will show you. So in narcolepsy in dogs, it's the same as in humans. If you really live with him, you would see that he's very sleepy. He would just like, oh, it's really nice because he looks at me and he's like this. And it almost looks like he loves me, but he's falling asleep. And but for a dog, of course, it's not as hard because they can nap whenever they want. So I think he has a relatively good life. But the second thing that he has is cataplexy. And for a dog, what gets a dog more excited is usually, having fun, playing. And for him, it varies from dog to dog, but of course, for most dogs, it's a food. And it has to be good food. I mean, it's not like if you give them like some kind of crap. It has to be, a French steak, by time. Or, Anne's chicken from Sri Lanka. That definitely does it. So we are going to see, I'm going to give him some chicken, and you will see that probably he will get so excited. You see already his nose is that he's going to probably have some attacks. And I don't know, sometimes it doesn't work. Dogs are like people. It's not, and they're like kind of, as you know, for cataplexy, it's just the same in people. When they're tense and, it doesn't work. It really, you have to be relaxed in an environment with your parents, with your friends. It's not something like if you're tense, sometimes patients with narcolepsy want to show me that they have cataplexy, and they can't because they are tense in my presence. You really have to be relaxed. So it's a little bit the same. So if you can, you have to be a little quiet so that it doesn't get like scared, and then otherwise, we'll see what happens. But it may not work. I can never guarantee it, but I think the chicken of Anna is pretty potent. So I myself thought about taking some. OK? Ça te va? Un petit peu de poulet? Oh, poulet. Poulet, mais alors je te raconte pas. Ça va marcher. Oof, just the smell, it's just... I mean, the excitement is very important, obviously. So I will try to add a little bit of play with it. And you'll see, you probably get paralyzed from the back legs. having cataplexy, but then the noise of the door woke him up. So he backtracked because he has some. Amen. C'est bon? I don't know if he will have a lot more. Sometimes he can collapse completely, sometimes. So you saw only like he got weak on his back legs, you know, and he kind of had to back up a little bit. I think that's all what he's going to show today. But so you see, I mean, it's not necessarily, you know, like dramatic, but sometimes, you know, if he's really excited, he can kind of collapse and be completely paralyzed for like a few minutes. But most often, you know, it's like a little bit of weakness in the legs. And of course, like people, he has it more when he's very tired. So for example, today, I think if he's around everyone, he's going to be like sleep deprived because he's always going to be, where is Dr. Mignot? And then he's going to be very tired at the end of the day, so you will see that he's going to have a lot more attacks. Now he's kind of fresh in the morning. So here is Watson. So now you have to listen to the lecture, is that okay? So you probably will see him fall asleep, but because I'm sure it's always a struggle to. He's not treated, by the way, so he's just that's the way he is normally, right? Because it's not so bad. So what today I'm going to talk to you about is new development in narcolepsy, and maybe a little bit about narcolepsy without cataplexy, and of course I will focus a little bit more on treatments. So these are the questions that I'm going to try to address, you know. What causes narcolepsy type 1, which probably a lot of people know. What causes narcolepsy type 2? What are the new treatment for narcolepsy type 1 and type 2? And when I talk about narcolepsy type 2, I really will include idiopathic hypersomnia because truly we think it's the same thing. There's no real differences. And then what still we need to know about narcolepsy type 1 and how we can figure that out. And then what you need to figure out about narcolepsy type 2 and how we can figure that out. So probably you all know that in 2000, thanks to the dogs with narcolepsy, actually we were breeding dogs with narcolepsy, and in narcolepsy it's a single gene, so it took us a long time to isolate the genes that cause narcolepsy in dogs, but it was a receptor for a chemical called Orexin, or hypocretin, and that's how we started to think, oh, this hypocretin is important for narcolepsy, and then we looked in humans and tried to figure out what was happening, and we knew that in humans it was not like dogs, like purely genetic. It was sporadic, that people who develop narcolepsy, usually it's just one person, they develop it either young kids, as young as 3 years of age, up to, you know, I've had even cases develop narcolepsy at 70, but that's quite rare. It usually peaks around, probably 14. It varies a little bit, some people think it's 20 that it peaks, but I think it's a little earlier because there is a bias, I think, and people don't remember when they started narcolepsy. So they have the tendency of probably putting it a little bit older than really it is, because they forget when they were very young. And some people believe there's a second peak of onset around 30 years of age. We discovered, and of course, that in humans, the cause of narcolepsy is not genetic, because most kids, you know, it's something you develop. So there is genetic factors, but it's not 100% genetic. You know, it's like many of disease, you have cardiovascular risk, and then your environment also triggers a disease, and narcolepsy is a bit the same. you have both genetics and environmental factors that are involved. But the cause is not really the orexin. Mutation is the orexin gene. It's just the orexin itself that's missing in the brain. So when you measure the orexin or the hypocretin, is the same thing. You can see in the graph on the left that if you measure it in the CSF, which they do systematically in everyone in Europe, and you can never be a prophet in your own country. Nobody does it here because it's like they think it's a bit traumatic, and I do understand that. You're certain of what you are finding, so you can really put narcolepsy type 1 into a box. You know that the cause is a lack of orexin, which I think will be probably helpful, especially when you treat patients with this new drug, orexin agonist. But still, it's a bit traumatic. Lumbar puncture is not fun. It's very, regular. There are thousands and thousands being done, but, if you don't need it, why doing it? So it remains not done in the US, but in Europe, for example, they do for everyone because they want to be certain. It's just a matter of style. They think it's a lifelong disease, so they really want to make sure is the person has narcolepsy type 1 or is the patient has narcolepsy type 2. And you see it's very striking, like most patients with narcolepsy type 1 and cataplexy, they have low CSF levels, and they also have a genetic marker called HLA-DQB10602, which indicates that it's some autoimmune. And indeed, you see that when we did this in the 2000, after we discovered the cause of narcolepsy, that if you stain the brain of patients with narcolepsy for this orexin chemical, it's lacking. On the top left, you see, this is a patient with narcolepsy. So it doesn't need, it's a good sign when you don't need statistics, Here is a normal person, and here is a patient with narcolepsy. So it's really completely gone. So the cause of narcolepsy type 1 is very simple, is you don't have orexin. That's it. And you can measure it in the cerebrospinal fluid, but it requires a lumbar puncture. And then you can also look in brain, but, unfortunately, at this stage, you have to be deceased, so that's not a very good indication. And so when we discovered that, things were not very well known about this orexin. We discovered it almost at the same time as this orexin chemical was discovered. And the orexin chemical, initially, it was discovered to be mostly in a deep part of the brain that's called the hypothalamus. So you see, you have this is a brain of a rat, and then, this is deep, deep, deep. Here you would have your optic nerves, and base of the brain. And this is a region called the hypothalamus, and that's where all the neurons that produce these chemicals are. And in patients with narcolepsy, they seem to be lacking. But then these neurons, these brain cells that contain orexin, they go everywhere into the brain, and they produce a lot of, they stimulate a lot of brain regions that themselves are very important to stay awake. And in particular, they stimulate certain groups of cells. For example, orexin stimulates histamine cells, which is another chemical that helps to stay awake. If you take antihistamine, it makes you sleepy. So that's one of the functions of orexin. It also stimulates dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, all kinds of neurotransmitters that themselves are normally very high when you're awake. So it's kind of a super little brain that excite other cells that themselves keep you awake. So it's not surprising that when you don't have orexin, people are very tired and they cannot stay awake for a long period of time. And so the main phenotype of narcolepsy is that they just cannot stay awake for a long period of time, because when you kind of try to stay awake, normally you need to increase your orexin. And when you sleep deprived, normal people, they increase more and more their orexin to try to fight being asleep. And of course, if you're sleepy, and of course, if you have no orexin, then it's almost impossible to stay awake after 2 hours or 3 hours of wakefulness. So that explains why people with narcolepsy, one of their problems is they wake up rested, but they need to take naps all the time because they're unable to sleep deprive themselves. They just can't stand having a sleep debt. And the second thing is that it seems to regulate REM sleep. It directly projects to some area of the brain stems that regulate REM sleep. And as a consequence, patients with narcolepsy go very quickly into REM sleep, and that's why they have cataplexy, which is like muscle weakness that looks very much like REM sleep when you have paralyzed, or sleep paralysis. They are half awake and half in REM sleep. So I think we understand quite well, how orexin works to produce a symptom of narcolepsy. but there's still some unknown, and that's one of the things that I will try to address today. One thing that's important to realize is that this orexin or hypocretin comes in two flavors. There is an orexin A and an orexin B, and they act on two receptors, orexin receptor 1 or orexin receptor 2. And it's, to make it even more confused, it's not like the orexin 1 or the orexin A act on one receptor and the orexin B acts on the other. It's more like one acts on one and the other acts on both. So it's a little confusing, but suffice to know that there's two subtypes of orexin, both are missing, and then most importantly, there are two receptors, receptor 1 and receptor 2. And it's important because now we know, you may think, okay, if you don't have orexin, we need to replace the receptor 1 and the receptor 2, because the orexin works on receptor 1 and receptor 2. And right now, it's important to realize that the drugs that are being developed only work on receptor 2. So by definition, they're not going to replace 100% of what orexin is doing, because it's only going to replace the receptor 2 activation by orexin, not the receptor 1 activation by orexin. However, we know that the receptor 2 is more important than the receptor 1. And the reason is that first, if you remove the receptor 2 from a mouse or from a dog, because the dog with narcolepsy have a mutation in the receptor 2, they have narcolepsy. When if you remove the receptor 1 and the receptor 2 still works because the orexin is there in a mouse, they kind of seems not to have much of a symptom. However, if you cross receptor 1 and 2 missing, they have more severe symptom. So it looks like the receptor 1 kind of makes things a little bit, it's like a compensatory, an additional little receptor that's less important than receptor 2, but it still plays a role, okay? And then there's some discussion whether or not receptor 1 could not be more important for certain aspects of physiology. In particular, some people are worried that receptor 1 could be more important for addiction, and that in some way having receptor 2 is better agonist drug on receptor 2 because it may avoid this drug to be drug of abuse. So it's just to tell you that there's receptor 1 and receptor 2, and they both probably are important for sleep, but receptor 2 for sure is much more important, maybe 90%, but it's important to realize that there's these other receptors that no one is really studying right now. Not many people are studying. So the next question is, what is the cause of narcolepsy? I mean, once you know, okay, they lack this orexin, they don't have the orexin stimulating receptor 1, receptor 2, which themselves stimulates all kind of other cells, dopamine, monoamines, and all kind of brain cells in the brain. So why? So one of the things that is, I always say is, when you're desperate, go back to genetics, because I love genetics. It's kind of my second, I found the cause of narcolepsy studying genetics in dogs. And of course, that was very difficult. It took me 10 years. A lot of people thought I was crazy, and probably I was, but it was okay. It turned out okay. But you go in humans, at the time you couldn't do that, and you can screen all the genes that could predispose to narcolepsy in human. And interestingly, you don't find orexin that much. What you find is genes of the immune system. You find genes that are very involved in autoimmune diseases. Almost like if you were to do type 1 diabetes, you will almost see the same thing. In fact, we can compare the genetic architecture, the genes that predispose to different disorder, and the closest match is type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease where you destroy your cells that produce insulin. So it's very similar to narcolepsy, but instead of destroying the cells that produce orexin, you destroy cells that produce insulin, and there are kids that need insulin perfusion, all their life. Another one is actually asthma and atopic disease, and in fact, it seems like there is quite a bit of genetic overlap between allergies and narcolepsy, but a lot of other autoimmune disease. So the second question that is then, okay, so narcolepsy is maybe an autoimmune disease where the immune system kind of attacks the orexin cells, and that's why you don't have orexin. So why? I mean, that's a good question. I should say that's a question that maybe for some of you may sound a little bit esoteric, because you say, my cells are not there anymore, so maybe what's the point of trying to figure out why? It's too late. But I still hope that one day I will make myself completely obsolete, which means that narcolepsy will not even develop in people. And the second reason is that for some of you who have narcolepsy, the chance of you having a child with narcolepsy is not high, so it's not necessary to panic, but it's still about 1% for each child. So it's not zero. I have some families with patients with narcolepsy, multiple, and so there is an increased risk, and probably if you could find a vaccination, etc., some things that blocks people from, when they're at risk, you know, they have the right genetics, and we say, maybe there is a 1 or 2% chance. Maybe that's worse to give them a special vaccine that could maybe prevent narcolepsy. And maybe we could also do other things. So I'm interested, and also to find diagnostic tests, because right now doing a lumbar puncture is not really great. If we would have a blood test that measures the orexin, the autoimmune process, an antibody, which in many autoimmune disease, you just do a blood test and you look at an antibody, you would maybe be able to diagnose everyone, which is a big problem right now, because for example, take people in this room, and probably I could get the 10% that are more likely to get narcolepsy. But between 10% and 0.03%, which is the prevalence of narcolepsy, of course, a lot of other things must happen. And in particular, what must happen is certain infections. And we pretty much know that the flu is critical. And we discovered that in two different ways. One, we discovered that in kids, where narcolepsy starts very abruptly, it's very often during spring and summer that they start narcolepsy, almost never in winter. And we also discovered that a lot of cases were triggered by this vaccine against the swine flu that was very particular, called Pandemrix, which somehow triggered narcolepsy about 4 to 6 months after the injection. So it was very much the same. You know, probably people get an infection during the winter, and then almost everyone starts narcolepsy during the spring and summer. And you see it more in children, because I'm sure some of you have developed narcolepsy in children. And in children, the mother can tell you sometimes it starts within a week. They tell you, my kid was totally normal, and then my kid suddenly gained weight and was like very tired and sleepy exactly this month, you know. And that's the one you see. Then when you plot this very acute onset, you really see this annual rhythm, and they almost all start during the spring and the summer. So we kind of knew that the flu was involved, and probably the H1N1, because they had this swine flu that triggered a lot of cases, like you see these big peaks, this new swine flu. And oh, that's interesting. Yes, so another, I didn't remember exactly the plan that I have on my slides, sorry. So another thing that we need to also improve is diagnosis for narcolepsy. So how can we do that? I think right now the big bottleneck is also going to go through these sleep studies. You know, it's kind of horrible. It takes a long time. And also going to the SNAP test. It takes a long time. Typically now you do this MSLT where you have these snaps every 2 hours, and we measure how fast you go to sleep and you go to REM sleep. It's not a bad test. It's 95% positive if you have narcolepsy type 1. If we do the lumbar puncture, you know, you do this test, it's almost always positive, 95%. Actually, not always. It's important, not always. There is about 5%, sometimes it's negative, and it's not because of that you don't have narcolepsy. No test is perfect, except maybe measuring orexin, at least it tells you. And even that is not perfect, because we know that some people can have normal levels of orexin at the beginning, and then lower a little bit later. Sometimes, you know, it's being destroyed, and when you catch it too early, they still have normal levels. So it's like everything. You really have to think about every case. But anyway, we think this is too long, it takes too long, and a lot of people are diagnosed with sleep apnea, and they do just a night sleep study. So we have used machine learning now. You know, I mean, I started to do machine learning about 7 years ago, so when it was really a baby field, but now you cannot hear anything about artificial intelligence and machine learning and blah, 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 and hopefully you invested in the stocks. Then, because now also the same way, we can actually diagnose narcolepsy using this kind of artificial intelligence only during the night sleep. So we do a night sleep study with the electrode, like for sleep apnea, and we look at how the computer predicts REM sleep and predict different sleep stages. And in narcoleptics, he has a lot of trouble. Why? Because when you have narcolepsy type 1, you often have half awake and half in REM sleep. That's exactly what this computer predicts, you see here, you see that in narcoleptics, there's often this very abnormal kind of patterns where the computer cannot predict if you are dreaming, which normally is in dark, or if you're awake, which is white, or in stage 1. So basically, the computer is confused. You train him to recognize REM sleep, wake, and light sleep, and it cannot distinguish both in narcolepsy. Why? Because narcoleptics experience this weird stage where they're half paralyzed, half dreaming. They are not in awake and not in REM sleep. So by using this kind of feature now, we can pretty much diagnose patients with narcolepsy without having to do an MSLT, at least narcolepsy type 1. So that's good because, you don't have to go through the NAP test anymore, and eventually it will make more people being diagnosed because everyone that goes through a sleep study can be diagnosed. We are doing, and it's very specific, and now we are adding genetics, we're trying to find new biomarker, but I think the real future will be with wearable, like you see here. What's new is not me, it's a device, It's like, now there are things that's incredible. You can kind of paste them on you, and they directly go to a computer, and it's not going to be this very complex PSG where you have probably you go to my lab, I will stick some stuff on you, and then you go back home and you sleep, and then it sends all the data to me, and then I do machine learning, I see, and boom, I could say if you have narcolepsy. So that could really increase diagnosis quite a bit. But of course, I would like to do even other things like, for example, if we could find biomarkers in the blood, that would be even better. But we have tried to measure orexin in blood. We have tried to measure cells that are abnormally activated by orexin, and we are continuing, but that's the other direction. If we could find a blood test for narcolepsy, that would really change things. So what about narcolepsy type 2? So narcolepsy type 2 is this people they don't have cataplexy, and then we do a sleep test, and they still go into REM sleep very quickly. So, and then there's this other disease that we call idiopathic hypersomnia, where they have no cataplexy, and then they fall asleep and they don't go into REM sleep, but they're still very sleepy. They fall asleep immediately. So traditionally, these two things have been separated, like narcolepsy type 2 was narcolepsy type 2, and idiopathic hypersomnia was different diseases. But then people quickly realized that practically it doesn't make sense. So if you have hypocretin deficiency, if we measure the low CSF and we do the MSLT, it's a very good test. You can repeat it, it's always positive. So it's a very specific test for narcolepsy type 1, but for narcolepsy type 2, it's nothing, it doesn't mean anything. So if you have no cataplexy, often you will have a positive test with 2 SRM, and then you repeat it 3 months later, and then it's negative, and you go to sleep quickly, because usually the sleepiness is constant, but going into REM sleep can really change from one day to the other for patients who have narcolepsy type 2 and idiopathic hypersomnia. We just don't know what it is, and the differentiation that we made based on the MSLT is probably completely, honestly, idiotic, because the test doesn't work. You repeat it, and then people switch from idiopathic hypersomnia to narcolepsy type 2, so we should probably call them the same thing, whatever you want, narcolepsy type 2 or idiopathic hypersomnia, and go on to treat them. That doesn't mean that they don't react to treatment, and we'll talk about that as well. So what are the new things that we found recently about narcolepsy type 1 first? So one of the exciting things we discovered recently that was a surprise to me is we knew that the flu H1N1 was triggering narcolepsy type 1 because of this, these swine flu things. And recently we discovered, and it was completely unexpected. It was a very difficult study, and it was actually confirmed by the Chinese in a completely independent sample, that there's another type of flu that seems to predispose to narcolepsy. So there's 4 types, I don't know if you remember, when you do your flu shots, you usually get 4 different flu strains. Influenza A, H1N1, influenza A, H3N2, influenza B, Yamagata, and influenza B, Victoria. I know it's very technical, but it's kind of 4 different lineage of flu that circulates. And we discovered that only 2 of these 4 are very strongly associated with narcolepsy. And surprisingly, another type of flu is also even more strongly associated with narcolepsy than H1N1 when you look for antibodies against the flu in the blood of people who just started narcolepsy. That was a complete surprise that we found recently. It's called influenza B Victoria. And that's actually very interesting because that means that these are the 4 types of flu. Actually, there is some rare bird flus that are also there, but there's really like 4 main branches, and it really makes it quite interesting because we are trying to find what's common between these different these different flus that trigger narcolepsy. Then there are also questions that are still looming. For example, is it only the orexin cells that are missing? You know, now we are having this orexin agonist and this hypocretin drugs, and we know that it helps patients tremendously, but maybe it doesn't work on everything. For example, you know, people don't lose weight as much as with Xyrem, for example. It doesn't touch the nighttime sleep. So is it because it only works on narcolepsy on the receptor 2, or is it because there is something else going on? And for example, there are some studies which need to be proven that suggest that maybe there are other cells in the brain that are missing, in particular cells that are involved in stress response, and maybe they don't, if you remove them by themselves, they don't show anything, but it could still be part of the picture. We cannot really be sure that only orexin cells are missing. And I'm going to pass this, but even one person that believes that the orexin cells are not dead, but maybe actually like zombie cells, they just have been silenced completely and don't work at all, but maybe they're still there and could be rescued. I personally believe it's very unlikely, but it's not impossible, because it's impossible to prove that zombies doesn't exist or God doesn't exist, or, you know, I mean, that's a little bit of the problem. And one more point is the first time ever there have been reports of patients that lacks the orexin. One of them we found, but one that has a mutation is the orexin gene. So the equivalent of a mouse without orexin. It's in Saudi Arabia, because in Saudi Arabia they often marry each other, so there's more chance of having like what's called a recessive disease. And they found a family of people who have no orexin because of a mutation in the gene. And interestingly, those people all had narcolepsy, but about half of them got much better with time. So again, you know, is orexin 100% of everything in narcolepsy? I'm not sure. Maybe there's some other factors. And maybe there are some people who have no orexin, but have a very mild phenotype, and they probably don't go to see the doctors. So, of course, what's really exciting about this whole thing is still trying to use the orexin for narcolepsy type 1, and obviously, since it's a cause of narcolepsy, it produces symptoms. And I'm not saying, what I said before was like, it's not like everything is orexin, but still, orexin is 90% of the whole thing, you know, for sure. And maybe the other thing make a difference in how severe it is, you know, that's more like how I see it. And this orexin 2 receptor is much more important than the other orexin receptor. And as you see it, like with the first times that people try this orexin agonist, which was one of them was called this things we have to perfuse, it was just amazing, because we were using this test where people have to stay awake if doing nothing, and that's torture for narcolepsy type 1. You know, they can't even stay 2 minutes. Like if you tell those narcoleptic patients type 1 to stay awake doing nothing, not looking at TV, not doing anything, I mean, they fall asleep in 2 minutes. And even with stimulants, Xyrem, any treatment, the best treated narcolepsies, they get to 10 minutes, which is very good, but never to the normal, which is 40 minutes. With this drug, everyone could stay awake 40 minutes all the time. So it's really a game changer, this orexin agonist. And this was confirmed with another drug from Takeda, which was also produced the same benefit. Like everyone was almost like, they didn't have any problem to fall asleep, and they were no more cataplexy. It's not perfect still, but it was really a game changer. The problem maybe is, I have the feeling that it didn't really change the weight as much, and also maybe the nighttime sleep was still disturbed. But you know, you have to realize this as a first drug, so we don't really know. Maybe you need a little bit of orexin during the night, for example. We don't know, so we are learning, because these drugs, they just have certain properties, and it's not perfect. And the good news is now, science has progressed so much that it's very easy to design new drugs. So in fact, I know of about 5 other companies that are lining up to try new drugs like this orexin agonist. So whether or not you like it, and it's good for you, it will come. Takeda will probably be the first one, but there are a lot of other companies who are developing this orexin agonist, And because they know it works, they know it's incredible effect in narcolepsy, and it's going to really be a game changer for narcolepsy type 1 for sure. And interestingly, people are very sensitive because you can imagine people who have narcolepsy type 1, you give them like a tiny bit and boom, they are awake immediately because, of course, they haven't seen orexin for a long time. So their receptor is like, give me some, you know, it's like, and in fact, the first time it's like if you have a light switch, often the patients don't sleep for 24 hours. Not in a negative way, actually, they're just very awake. And then after it settles, and the narcolepsy type 2, when we have tried, it works, but you need a dose that's higher because, of course, they have receptors, so you have to supplement higher than the normal value, which is still okay. I mean, a lot of drugs that we use, when you use stimulants, they work on dopamine, and obviously people who take them, they have dopamine, so you're just increasing something that's normal. So it'd be the same for orexin agonists in NT2. It will still help them a lot, and we know that, but it's not going to be maybe as sensitive. Maybe you need a higher dose. And so this Takeda drug just finished phase 2 and is successful, so they are going to go into phase 3, which is a very large number of people, and they want to see you know, how it's going to work on a large number of people and if it's safe mostly. Because they know it works incredibly well, but they have to show that they can keep it for 1 year, 2 years, and there is no side effect. And I mean, we know already we have some patients for years, a year or a year and a half, and they're doing quite well. So what remains to be done? So I think one of the questions is, what is the true spectrum of orexin? As I told you, maybe orexin is 90% of the story, and orexin receptor 2 is 90% of 90%, but there's probably some little things. What is the role of the receptor 1? It's a little odd, you know, some people that don't have orexin, in these mutations, they sometimes get better, they're not as severe, so maybe there are other things that sometimes get destroyed together with orexin. We don't know. It may be a little bit more complicated than just orexin, and maybe we don't know everything. The second thing is there is probably milder cases that are not diagnosed. We probably need you know, better procedure for diagnosing. We really have a problem with the diagnosis. So we need to figure out a way we can diagnose like large number of people. I work with the UK Biobank, which is an incredible structure, 500,000 people who have, you know, like questionnaires and the health record, et cetera, genetics, and even some of them have worn actigraphy. And we're trying to see if we can detect the narcoleptics just with a watch, you know, like a watch or something like this, together with a few questions with narcolepsy, with cataplexy and the genetics, because you know how many people are diagnosed out of 500,000 UK people? 1, whereas you expect actually 150. So it's just to show you how poorly diagnosed it's in the UK. Actually, in France, in the US, it's much better. I think it would have been about 50%. 50% of patients with narcolepsy are diagnosed, but in the UK or some other countries, it's really dramatic. Second thing we need to do, so if we could have a blood test, you know, this would like change everything. So I'm still trying, yeah. And, but I don't know. I mean, it's hard. It's like, you know, this is a hard science. You know, you just can search for a while and may work, may not work. But this is what we need to do. We need to understand how the flu triggers, you know, narcolepsy type 1, because that would really help to figure out exactly what happened, prevent it, etc., and diagnostic maybe. And then we need to improve the therapies, and for sure, you know, the receptor 2 is a big change. You know, with Xyrem and etc., you really help a lot of patients with narcolepsy type 1 and narcolepsy type 2, but it's the apocritin receptor 2, the orexin receptor 2 agonists are going to change everything. For narcolepsy type 2, I want to point out that for a while, you know, we used to use stimulants. You know, this is the treatment that we used a lot for narcolepsy type 2. But more recently, and that's, I think, the new developments that are very exciting about narcolepsy type 2, we really realized that Xyrem, which is all the derivatives, this sodium oxybate, this very old drug that you take at night and make you sleep better, and it really helps narcolepsy type 1. People lose weight and they are more awake, and that's one really game-changing treatment versus the stimulants and the, you know, the other drug. And now we have discovered that, you know, this type of drugs First, there are several formulations now. There is a short-acting, the old one, but now there's a low sodium, and there's a long-acting one. They work not only for narcolepsy type 1, but they also work quite well on narcolepsy type 2. And I have to tell you that there's a little bit of a structure, or idiopathic hypersomnia. You give people this drug at night, and they feel much better in the daytime. And it can really be a game changer. So, I mean, for people with narcolepsy type 2 or idiopathic hypersomnia, I really want you to remember to maybe try sodium oxybate. It can really be a complete game changer. It works as well as in narcolepsy type 1. But you have to know what you are doing, and it's a bit of a scary drug. And so I think the treatment is really changing very rapidly. And what I want to point out, this is like a general idea, but you separate narcolepsy type 1 and narcolepsy type 2, and most likely, they are treated a little bit the same way. I think sodium oxybate is getting more and more important for narcolepsy type 2, whereas before we were traditionally using more stimulants. And then, of course, there will be this new compound, Orexin agonists, that are going to change everything. And personally, I believe that a combination of Xyrem and Orexin agonist is probably going to be like the best ever for patients who have narcolepsy type 1. And as I mentioned, they work. The orexin agonist can also make people with narcolepsy type 2, which have orexin, feel much better. It just works at a higher dose. For narcolepsy type 2, we need new diagnostic criteria. Maybe we'll need to relabel the name of idiopathic hypersomnia into narcolepsy type 2, and we'll probably need to understand subtypes. We first have to lump everyone that has narcolepsy type 2 and idiopathic hypersomnia, but there's probably a lot of subtypes, because there's a study we have done which suggests that up to 2% of the general population has idiopathic hypersomnia, if you kind of look at the criteria. So it's much more common than narcolepsy, type 1. But there's probably many different subtypes. So we really have to figure out what's the role of circadian rhythm, what's the role of poor sleep, what's the role of wake promoting, and there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done. And again, studying new medication with subsets that we discovered, but not based on the MSLT, but based on real research, will be really important. So I think that's all what I wanted to say. So in general, it's never been such an exciting time for narcolepsy. We really now understand well narcolepsy type 1, but I want to just show that we don't understand 100% of it. I really do believe that there are milder cases in the population that are completely undetected. I really do believe that there is a role of other things in addition to orexin, and the receptor 1, of course, is one possibility. And we need better biomarkers so that nobody has to go through this sleep test all the time, which is too slow and we cannot scale it up. For example, a blood sample would be great. Immune or not, we need to understand how it's triggered. And for narcolepsy type 2, now we know that narcolepsy type 2 and idiopathic hypersomnia are probably the same thing. We can't distinguish them clinically. It's just people who are tired without a reason. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't treat them, and we are realizing that Xyrem is really effective in some of these patients. It has to be, you really have to know what you're doing, but it can really be transformative versus just what we were doing before with just stimulants. And then, in my opinion, we need to understand more what the general sleep physiology abnormal in these people. So I think some of these patients with idiopathic hypersomnia, they have a problem with their circadian clock. Often they have problem falling asleep and waking up. So there's probably some circadian abnormalities, more like very delayed, as opposed to some of them, their sleep may not be good enough. Some of them are wake promoting things not good enough. Even the orexin might be involved. But we have to really kind of put back narcolepsy type 2 and idiopathic hypersomnia together and start to redifferentiate them based on other criteria, notably treatment. But we also made a lot of progress in the treatment of narcolepsy type 2 and idiopathic hypersomnia, but we didn't make any progress in the cause of this problem. In fact, if anything, we discovered that everything we thought was wrong. So that we have to really go back to the drawing board. But as you probably know, going back to the drawing board is tough because there's a lot of vested interest. There are people who do this, who do that, and we have to convince everyone. Even so, all the scientists agree in Europe, everything, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, is going to take 10 years before changing its mind, that's like the government. So but that's the direction we need to go. So thank you so much, and I'm sorry, I know I was a little long, but certainly I will be happy to answer questions, and also I have another, I think, talk later, so I can answer questions as well there. Thank you.
Dr. Mignot, there is a question from one of our virtual members of the audience. Can you hear? Mary asks if there are studies done or are there studies being done for the correlation between COVID and narcolepsy?
Yes. No, there are no studies, but there is an observation that's absolutely quite striking, is that everyone has had the same observation. During COVID, nobody started narcolepsy type 1. So there were no flu because people were really careful. So people didn't get COVID, but they also didn't get any flu. And actually, very few cases started narcolepsy during this period of time. Amazingly now, just now, because people are reopening, as there's a lot of new cases of narcolepsy, but during the COVID time, nobody started narcolepsy. And in fact, I always ask, I've seen new onset patients, and I always ask when they started, and it's never during the COVID time. Either it's before it started COVID or it's after. So I think at the opposite, COVID, I think it turned out paradoxically that by taking all these masks and so forth, people had less flu, and then they were less trigger for narcolepsy type 1. Now, for narcolepsy type 2 and idiopathic hypersomnia, it's more complicated. I told you it's kind of a potpourri of things, and as we know that narcolepsy type 2 and idiopathic hypersomnia, there are probably some cases that have post-viral. I mean, again, it's a potpourri of things, and I'm sure that some people may develop like brain inflammation or secondary things post-COVID. There's like a lot of descriptions of people who are doing poorly after long COVID, what they call, and I'm sure that some long COVID may have manifestation of daytime sleepiness and narcolepsy-like, idiopathic hypersomnia-like symptoms. It's just not very studied, but not narcolepsy type 1.